lack of charging infrastructure is often cited as a barrier to people considering buying an electric vehicle in Australia. Building out a network of chargers is a difficult and expensive process, and the federal government is spending millions of dollars to expand the network. But now the standard old power pole is being trialled as a possible solution to the charging shortage. Dan Cass is a research affiliate with the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney, and he joins us now from Melbourne. Dan Cass, welcome. So what do you make of the pace of the rollout of charging facilities in Australia so far?
Well, look, it's been quite slow. We had quite a climate and culture war around EVs and this worry that they might, sabotage the weekend and so on. But I think voters are really voting as consumers and buying EVs increasingly in this country, including at the lower price range. There are several models now priced below $40,000, so they're very competitive in an upfront cost sense. And as people hear about vehicles from friends and experience them, they see that they're very safe, they're very fast, accelerate incredibly fast. They're very quiet and comfortable, and they can save a lot of money. So if you think of the average driver spending something like 20 cents a kilometre to drive their car over a year, if they swap that for an EV, they might save in the realm of $1,000. You might be paying a cent or two per kilometre that you drive. So the question is how to get the EV chargers rolled out.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the provision of chargers, how much potential is there in placing chargers on power poles?
Look, it's a great idea. Power poles are everywhere that people live around this country. At the moment, there's only 7,000 or so chargers in the country, and there's 21 million vehicles. That includes trucks and buses and so on, and not all passenger vehicles. But that's clearly a really small network. And the beauty of the poles is they're where people park their cars on the streets, and particularly in urban areas where 2/3 of residents don't have their own off-street parking, they otherwise couldn't charge while they're at home. They can only use those fast chargers that are maintained by companies around the city and country areas. But the thing is that these pole chargers would be slower to use, but much cheaper to pay for the energy. So you could fill your tank up and really still be enjoying the savings that are part of the reason to buy an EV in the first place.
Okay, so there's a possibility that we could see a proliferation of charging stations on power poles, but is there a danger that big companies could end up dominating the market and consumers lose out?
Yeah, there is. And so already in the energy industry in Australia, we've got a lot of consumers being charged much more than they should for their electricity. This is the sort of the lazy tax that people pay if you don't churn through retailers at a pace of knots and check how much you're being charged. They quietly put your tariffs up. The same dynamic could operate with EV charging. And at the moment, the default is really that the distribution networks are in the best position to maintain this infrastructure because they manage the poles. But the question is, firstly, how we regulate that process if the big distribution networks do end up owning this infrastructure, or alternately, do we encourage this other model where third-party providers put the chargers in and maintain them and manage the business contracts that result then in the sale of energy to the consumer as electricity?
And what about other means of increasing the provision of charging stations? Do you see the old power pole model as a bit of a silver bullet, or should there be much further expansion in other ways?
Yeah, look, the big fast chargers are very important, particularly in the country. So if you want to drive, across from, Sydney to Adelaide to see the family, you don't want to stop and wait for hours and hours to charge your car up. And increasingly, the technology in batteries and in chargers is decreasing the time it takes to fill up the tank with electrons. So a big, wide country like Australia certainly needs a lot of those big, very capital-intensive fast chargers, big DC chargers. But the beauty of the pole charging is we can put the chargers all around the suburbs where solar power is generated on people's roofs. And at the moment, this solar power is being treated like a problem. There's the so-called solar duck curve where there's too much power in the day and coal power stations, for example, are being turned off. the beauty of the distribution of charges around the suburbs where solar is we can solve two problems at once. We can soak up all that excess solar and sell it back to ourselves as car drivers, and do so very cheaply.
But I see at the moment that that is not happening cheaply for some people.
Yeah, well, it's the same story, unfortunately, Joe, that people have with retail electricity, that there is a lot of confusion in the market and the regulators aren't always strongly enough on the side of the consumer. And sometimes the retailers really do take the opportunity to use that confusion to put up prices. So, look, I think the potential here for Australia is massive. Consumers can be saving in the realm of $1,000 or more a year if they drive their car a lot by getting out of an internal combustion engine and into an EV. There's big benefits for the grid because if we use those rolling batteries on wheels to back up the grid and soak up that excess solar in the middle of the day, that will lower the cost of the energy transition for all consumers. So there's big benefits here. But anytime there's big money to be made and there's monopolies involved, it's very important the government and the regulators are a tough cop on the beat to make sure the rules are fair.